In the early hours of a wet spring morning, not long after the river had pulled back from the edge of downtown St. Louis, a teamster leading a wagon along Morgan Street stopped for a reason he could not easily explain. The mud had thinned just enough to show shape. Not rubble, not driftwood, not random debris pushed in by the Mississippi. Shape. A straight line in the earth, then another, then the dark rectangle of what looked like a doorway, lower than the street, lower than it should have been, its upper frame pressed against packed soil as if the city had settled on top of it and simply kept walking. He called another man over, then another. One of them crouched, one of them brushed away grit with his sleeve, and there, under the fresh filth of the street, was not a cellar hatch, not a sewer opening, but the top portion of a storefront face, a front below the front. That is the part people still struggle with, because the official version is simple. St. Louis was a river city. The Mississippi flooded. The levee had to be improved. Streets were widened. Grades changed. Brick and cast iron replaced older materials. That is the respectable explanation. It sounds practical. It sounds civic. It sounds finished. But the story did not end there. Because when you stand in the oldest surviving riverfront district today, especially around Laclede Landing, the official record begins to feel less like a full explanation and more like a label pasted over a locked door. Some buildings do not sit right against the present street. Some windows slope at an angle that does not match the road outside. Some lower openings feel too tall, too formal, too carefully built to be dismissed as ordinary basement vents. And in the stories that circle these streets, the detail that keeps coming back is the most unsettling one of all. Buried storefront frames that looked so intact they were said to still hold glass. Not shattered evidence, not ruin, a face preserved below the surface. And if that sounds exaggerated, wait until you see what the official record itself quietly admits. The City of St. Louis Historic Preservation Record says the Great Flood of 1844 stretched 12 miles wide between 2nd Street south of Mill Creek and the bluffs east of the American Bottoms. 12 miles wide. That is not a nuisance flood. That is not a little water at the curb. That is a city-scale event pressing directly against the old commercial edge of St. Louis. Then came the next blow. On the night of May 17, 1849, a fire began on the steamboat White Cloud and spread along the riverfront. The current carried the burning Edward Bates into other docked boats. Wind drove flames into levee cargo. Tobacco burned, fur burned, lumber burned. Fire Captain Thomas Targey ordered buildings blasted with gunpowder to create a firebreak and was killed in the attempt. By morning, 23 steamboats and almost 15 city blocks were gone. That is the official version. But what happened after the flood and after the fire may matter even more than the disasters themselves. Because in rebuilding the downtown riverfront, the levee was expanded, streets were widened, and brick and cast iron were used to reconstruct the business district. That line is easy to read quickly. Most people do. Expanded, widened, rebuilt. Reasonable words, safe words. But widen a street enough, alter the grade enough, and what exactly happens to the old edge of the city beneath it? What do you cover? What do you seal? And what exactly was already there when the new surface went down?
If you want to understand why this case refuses to stay buried, start with one structure. The Scholerhorn Albrecht building on North 2nd Street was built before 1844, before the modern street grid settled into the shape people now assume has always existed. That matters because the building predates the Great Flood, predates the Great Fire, and stands like a witness that outlived both. And the strange part is still visible. According to the architectural history of Laclede's Landing, if you visit in person, you can see that the slope of the windows on Morgan Street does not match the current grade of the road. Read that again. The windows and the road disagree. That is not how ordinary age works. That is not just settling brick. That is a surviving relationship to an earlier street condition, a memory in masonry, a line from a previous surface that the official version never fully erased. Now imagine the first people who noticed it. Not tourists, not online theorists, workers, tenants, delivery men, maintenance crews, the kind of people who touch old walls because they have to, the kind of people who open stuck doors, lift warped floorboards, and shine flashlights where no one else bothers to look. In every old city, they are the last real witnesses, and their accounts rarely make it into clean public history. One old local account describes the discomfort perfectly. You descend expecting a basement, but the proportions feel wrong. The ceiling is too high. The brick openings are too broad. The framing suggests commerce, not storage. The room does not feel built under the city. It feels like the city was built over it. That is the difference. A basement belongs below. A buried first floor does not. And this is where it gets darker. Because once that possibility enters the mind, the rest of the district begins to change shape. The uneven sidewalks on Morgan Street between 2nd and Collins Alley are not just odd sidewalks anymore. Underneath them, according to the same architectural account, is a cellar room purportedly used to hide runaway slaves on the way to Illinois. Whatever one makes of that claim, it confirms something crucial. There are spaces below these present surfaces that belonged to another layer of use, another layer of traffic, another layer of life. The story did not end there. Look at the old Judge Coffee Building at 710 North 2nd. Its features include cast iron columns at street level and large lower windows with matching smaller windows above. Large lower windows, not tiny basement slits, not afterthought openings, designed openings, commercial openings, human-scale openings for a public face. And when people see those lower proportions repeated across the old riverfront blocks, a question forms almost automatically. How much of what we call the ground floor is really the second version? How much of old St. Louis is still standing one level lower than the map suggests? This is the part where skeptics usually say the same thing. Grade changes were common, river cities adapted, streets rose, buildings were modified. End of story. Maybe, but the official explanation does not fully answer the emotional texture of these places. Because when cities adapt, they usually leave signs of transition. Plans, cutaway drawings, clean records, consistent retrofits. What keeps people staring at these blocks is the opposite feeling. Not clean transition, compression, silence, buried geometry, mismatched lines, spaces that feel interrupted, then sealed, then forgotten. And forgotten by whom? That question matters more than people think, because history is not only what was built, it is also what later generations chose not to explain.
By the time the riverfront was rebuilt in brick and cast iron, St. Louis was no longer a frontier outpost trying to survive. It was becoming a machine. Goods moved through it. Rail and river met here. Warehouses rose. Tobacco, whiskey, iron, coffee, produce, freight, all of it passed through these blocks, which means one thing the modern viewer often misses. The ground level of this district was money. Every doorway mattered, every loading entrance mattered, every inch of access to the levee mattered. So when you find old commercial proportions lower than expected, the mystery gets heavier. Because burying part of a warehouse is one thing, losing part of a storefront edge in a city built on trade is another. The official record says the rebuilding after 1849 widened streets and expanded the levee. Fair enough, but that phrase may conceal a more dramatic physical act than people imagine. To widen and elevate a riverfront district, you do not just draft better plans. You move earth, you redirect surfaces, you create retaining conditions. You decide what to demolish, what to rebuild, what to fill, and what to leave sealed under the new grade because it is faster, cheaper, or politically convenient. And this is where witness detail begins to matter. In city after city, the workers who altered the surface were rarely the ones who wrote the polished history. Laborers leave payrolls, contractors leave invoices, engineers leave summary language, but the little things vanish. The bricked doorway found halfway down a trench, the intact threshold under fill, the frame nobody expected to see, the lower room that still smelled dry long after it should have rotted. Missing pages do not always disappear from an archive. Sometimes they disappear from the story before anyone writes them down. That may be why certain details survive only as fragments. A property line that no longer makes sense, a sidewalk that rides unevenly over something rigid below, a lower wall too finished to be accidental, a merchant address on an older map that seems to place the entrance at a level no longer visible from the present street. And yes, what haunts people most is how normal the buried layer seems to have been. Not ceremonial, not mythical, normal. That is what makes it powerful. If true, these were not underground temples. They were shops, workrooms, storage fronts, public faces of a city people entered every day. Men carrying ledgers, women picking through goods, dray horses backing toward iron-framed doors, a child sent with a note, a clerk opening shutters at dawn. Then, years later, those same openings covered, flooded, sealed, or swallowed by the revised surface of downtown. What they found was not exotic, it was familiar, and that makes the burial feel worse. Because a hidden chamber is one thing, a hidden ordinary life is another. It suggests not just loss, but replacement, one city laid over another while memory was still warm. There are accounts in old districts like this of elderly residents pointing to low arches and saying that their fathers called them the old level. No plaque, no formal marker, just oral residue. The kind of testimony history often treats as disposable until a photograph or a trench cut suddenly gives it weight. But that was not the end. Because once you accept that some of these lower architectural relationships are real, the mystery widens far beyond one building. The pre-1844 structures, the altered grades, the widened streets, the covered cells beneath uneven sidewalks, the riverfront rebuilt after catastrophe. The official version begins to sound less like a complete account and more like a compressed one. Not false, exactly. Compressed. And whenever history feels compressed, somebody usually decided what could be left out.
Now step back from Morgan Street and look at the pattern. A city hammered by water in 1844. A city burned at its commercial heart in 1849. A riverfront then rebuilt with new materials, revised widths, and altered surfaces. Old buildings still standing, old lines still visible, old lower relationships surviving in stone, iron, and brick, where the new grade never fully erased them. This is where the buried city theory starts attracting people who distrust the official record. Because the official record does admit catastrophe. It does admit rebuilding. It does admit widening and expansion. What it does not do, at least not in the everyday public telling, is linger on the physical violence of that transition. It does not force you to picture the city half open, layered, cut, raised, packed, bricked, and covered. It gives the result without dwelling on the process. And process is where uncomfortable truth lives. Imagine the pressure of that moment. River trade could not stop. Investors could not wait forever. Merchants needed access. Civic leaders needed confidence. The city needed to look modern, stable,
elevated above disaster, not psychologically trapped inside it. In that atmosphere, would everything have been carefully excavated and preserved? Or would some of the old frontage simply have been absorbed into the new level and written off as necessary sacrifice? One possibility is that the answer is painfully ordinary. Speed, expense, development pressure, no grand secret, just the brutal logic of a city racing forward. But even that safer explanation carries a darker implication. It means entire pieces of lived urban reality can vanish in plain sight, not because they were impossible to document, but because once the new surface is accepted, the old one becomes inconvenient. And inconvenience is one of history's most effective burial tools. There is a reason these mysteries thrive around riverfronts, lower streets, and old warehouse belts. Those are the zones where utility beats sentiment, the zones where cities cut corners first and narrate later. A buried sanctuary would provoke argument. A buried row of storefronts might provoke a shrug. Until someone notices the windows, until someone notices the slope, until someone asks why the road and the facade disagree. And then the whole mood changes, because this is no longer just architecture. It becomes testimony without a voice. The wall is the witness, the threshold is the witness, the lower frame is the witness. The building cannot explain itself, but it can refuse to line up with the official version. That refusal is what keeps hidden history audiences coming back to cases like this. Not because every buried opening proves a wild civilizational theory, not because every sealed lower level points to a lost age, but because the pattern is psychologically undeniable. Again and again we find older urban layers not merely ruined, but covered, not merely destroyed, but integrated into later reality so thoroughly that most people stop seeing the seam. And St. Louis may be one of the cleanest examples of that seam still showing. The oldest riverfront district remains. The disasters are documented. The rebuilding is documented. The anomalies are visible. The city kept moving. The records kept simplifying. And somewhere between those two motions, a lower St. Louis fell quiet.
The biggest implication is not that St. Louis has secrets. Every old city has secrets. The biggest implication is that the buried layer may not be a side note at all. It may be the emotional truth of the place. Think about that. The first commercial face of the riverfront, the earlier street relation, the entrances shaped for another grade, the rooms now below the feet of passers-by. If even part of that old level survives inside foundations and behind sealed fronts, then downtown St. Louis is not simply historic, it is doubled. There is the city presented to visitors, and there is the city it stands on. That is why the title detail is so effective and so unnerving. The storefronts they buried still have glass in the frames. Whether taken literally in every case or remembered as a recurring local image, it captures the real horror of urban burial, not total destruction, but suspended interruption. A place left so suddenly or repurposed so bluntly that part of its face remained. Glass is intimate. Brick can survive anything. Iron can survive a lot. But glass implies exposure. It implies seeing and being seen. It implies a shop window, daylight, reflection, ordinary commerce, someone once standing inches behind it. To imagine that face still trapped below the revised street is to feel time not as distance, but as pressure. And this is where the human detail enters. Because whenever an old urban layer is rediscovered, there are always people who take it too personally. The local historian who starts comparing fire maps at 2 in the morning, the preservation volunteer who cannot stop staring at one mismatched facade, the widow who remembers her husband coming home after basement work, quiet for days, saying only that the room down there was too finished. The maintenance worker who jokes at first, then refuses to go back alone. The man who sketches what he saw and later burns the sketch because he thinks it sounds foolish. The woman who keeps a note in a drawer that reads, "Old street below present line," with no date and no explanation.
That is how these stories survive, not always in official reports, in changed behavior, in unfinished sentences, in the look people get when they realize a city can forget itself on purpose. And the official explanation still does not fully answer that feeling. Yes, flood. Yes, fire. Yes, rebuilding. All true, all documented. But what matters is the pattern. A riverfront district old enough to remember a different grade. Buildings that physically indicate another relationship to the street. Lower spaces concealed beneath later surfaces. A city rewarded for moving on quickly. A public memory trained to admire the skyline and ignore what sits one level down. If true in the strongest sense, St. Louis was not merely repaired, it was edited. Not erased completely, that would have been cleaner. Instead, it was revised, and the revision left seams. That may be why the case feels larger than one district, because once you see one buried frontage clearly, you start wondering how many other cities did the same thing and later called it progress. How many lower streets became basements? How many first floors became foundations? How many ordinary lives were covered, mapped over, and reassigned to silence? What they found down there may not overturn history, but it may expose how history is managed.
So when you walk those blocks in St. Louis now, especially near the old riverfront, pay attention to what does not sit right. Not the grand monuments, not the polished tourist frame, the small betrayals. A window whose slope belongs to another road. A sidewalk that rises oddly over a hidden void. A lower opening too elegant to be dismissed. A building older than the flood, older than the fire, still standing there like a witness nobody fully deposed. The official record gives you disaster, recovery, improvement, and some of that is undoubtedly true. But beneath that clean sequence is another possibility, that the city did not simply survive catastrophe, it crossed over itself. It covered parts of its first commercial face, widened past them, and taught later generations to call the remaining signs curiosities instead of evidence. Buried, sealed, covered, flooded, those words return for a reason, because they are not just describing architecture, they are describing memory. And maybe that is why stories like this never really die. People sense when a place is still holding something. They sense when the road beneath their feet is newer than the walls beside them. They sense when a city's official version is too smooth for the scars still visible in brick. St. Louis may never hand over a perfect confession. There may never be one dramatic file, one final map, one sealed chamber opened on camera with everything laid out inside. History is rarely that generous. But the story did not end there. It lives in the surviving misalignment. It lives in the pre-1844 facades. It lives in the rebuilt riverfront after 1849. It lives in the lower rooms under uneven pavement. It lives in every old frame that suggests the street outside is not the first street that passed that wall. And if that is true, then the buried storefronts of St. Louis are more than a local curiosity. They are a warning, a reminder that cities do not only rise, sometimes they rise by pressing their earlier selves into the dark and calling the silence normal. If this is the kind of case you follow all the way down, stay with this channel, because the deeper pattern is never just one city, one witness, or one sealed level. It is the official version above and the buried past below.